Good morning. Thank you for joining us today for Webinar 2, History and Language Revitalization. Webinar maintenance, real quick. The presentation will be 45 minutes with time for questions at the end. Please remain muted throughout the presentation. Please enter your questions in the chat and they will be answered in the Q&A at the end of the presentation. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please message the host, Kim Begay, and the webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website. Next slide, please. 2 additional webinars will be presented in this series, and they include the education systems and programs at Pueblo Villages with Kevin Shendo, Director of Education, and the impact of First Nations and the value of your support with Mike Roberts, President and CEO of First Nations. Additional information for the webinars will be shared with you soon. Next slide. My name is JoAnn Melchor. I'm Northern Cheyenne, Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa. I am the Associate Director of Individual Giving at First Nations Development Institute. I have been with First Nations for 9.5 years. Prior to joining First Nations, I worked at the American Indian College Fund for 5 years. I would like to quickly introduce a few members of my team. Kim Begay, Navajo. She's the Development Associate, and Derek Silversmith, Navajo, is Individual Giving Associate. Kim and Derek will be assisting this morning with the slideshow and the Q&A. November is National Native American Heritage Month. This month and every month, we celebrate the ingenuity, culture, and resiliency of Native communities. Today is the second of 4 webinars in our National Native American Heritage Month webinar series. We started this webinar series on November 5th with an introduction to the 19 Pueblos of New Mexico. The 19 Pueblos of New Mexico are a historic and important part of Indian country that have contributed to Native American culture and lifeways since time immemorial. In this webinar, First Nations Vice President JoAnn Melchor, Santo Domingo Pueblo, reflected on the significance of these pueblos and provided insights and perspectives about these incredible settings. As a lifelong resident and community advocate of Santo Domingo Pueblo, JoAnn highlighted Pueblo communities' unique gifts and resilience, past and present. She shared a general overview of Pueblo history and New Mexico's communities' current state and demographics. I would like to introduce JoAnn Melchor. JoAnn joined First Nations in July 2024 as the first Vice President of Development. JoAnn previously served as the CEO of the New Mexico Foundation in Santa Fe. She was also the Director of Advancement for Keres Children's Learning Center in Cochiti Pueblo, and she is also a fluent Keres speaker. JoAnn attended the University of New Mexico, completing coursework in sociology and psychology, and earning a management certificate from the Anderson School of Management. She currently serves as Vice Chair of the Board of Groundworks New Mexico and is a board member of Silver Bullet Productions and New Mexico Humanities Council. Throughout her career, whether in professional or volunteer roles, JoAnn continues to lead with a passion for community, people, and making the world a better place. Today, JoAnn will be joined by Trisha Moquino of Cochiti, Ohkay Owhingeh, and Kewa, co-founder of the Keres Children's Learning Center. Trisha will share the history of Pueblo languages and how KCLC navigates the challenges surrounding the loss of language and its revitalization. I will now ask JoAnn to introduce Trisha Moquino.
Okay, good morning, everybody. This is JoAnn, and thank you for that introduction, JoAnn. I am very happy to introduce my colleague, my sister, and an amazing leader, Trisha Moquino. She's the co-founder of the Keres Children's Learning Center. She is the Keres Speaking Montessori Guide, and she's currently the co-director of the Indigenous Montessori Institute. I had the pleasure of working with Trisha for about 3 years at the Keres Children's Learning Center, and I loved being there. So, introducing Trisha. Welcome, Trisha.
Good morning, everybody. Goetzi kuchechash kwenye matsoiteran hapani hanuch osuta kukit kukihoa ko Ohkay Owhingeh asi osuta. Good morning, everybody. My name is Trisha, and I'm from Cochiti, Kewa, and Ohkay Owhingeh, and I'm really happy to be here with you all. Atura start dishte. So I am the co-founder of KCLC. My daughters inspired me to want to start KCLC. I was in the public school system for probably about 7 years and then left and worked maybe 2 years in between private and then another 4 years in Bureau of Indian Education schools and started basically work on KCLC 6 years before. And one of the things our founding members made sure that we knew and that we did is that the language is the intellectual property of each tribe, even though we share Keres, with 6 other tribes. So if we can go ahead and share the screen with the map of the Pueblos. So with I tried to share my screen and I was unable to. So with that, the tribe Cochiti Pueblo did a language survey in 1992, 1993, and they gathered information and found out that only people above the age of 34 years old were fluent in the language as a first language, the Keres Cochiti dialect. And then decided to do something about it and then employed the consultation of Dr. Christine Sims, who then brought in Dr. Rebecca Blum Martinez, both who eventually became professors at UNM, but they were trained by, we like lovingly call her our Chinese grandma, Lily Wong Fillmore, who is a retired professor from San Francisco, but retired from Cal Berkeley. And so they came in and worked with the tribe to develop a summer language immersion program. And then the leader of the education program at that time was Dr. Mary Eunice Romero Little. And she called me one day and she's like, "Do you want to come work with us?" And I'm like, "No, I don't speak the language very well." And then she said, "Well, you speak it better than me." And I'm like, "Oh, okay." And then I had always had a love for language. And then I worked in the summer language program for 10 years. And we got really good training in language immersion. And one of the first things that they showed us was the 3-period lesson. I became a public school teacher a few years later and then was introduced to Montessori. And again, this 3-period lesson, I was like, oh my gosh, we can use Montessori to help us revitalize our language. And then tried to work with the district to create a classroom, and they weren't having it. And I soon came to the realization that I wouldn't even want to put my own daughter, who was fluent, whose first language was Keres. At the time, she was the only daughter we had. At the time, we have 2 now. And then I was like, where do we send her for her, like the next step in her early childhood learning? And although we had head starts on both of our tribes of Kewa and Cochiti, we were living in our Cochiti family home at the time, they were both centered in English. And so that began the journey of KCLC, and it took lots of people to get KCLC where it is today. We have, we have the whole range now in Montessori. They have what's called infant toddler, which is birth to 3. And then we have primary, and the primary classroom was 3 to 6-year-olds, and that is the classroom that we started with. And that was an immersion program, just all immersion. And then 3 years later, we opened up our dual language elementary classroom. And so that was that for about 10 years. And then on the other side, we got another ANA grant, which we were blessed to receive. And we started the infant toddler. And then on the other side, we started the adolescent. And all this information, this relationship graphic you can see on our website, and that will be shared later. But a lot of people ask, like, why did you introduce dual language education in elementary? And dual language happens when you are there's different types of dual language, not different types, but different models. There's a heritage language model, there's a two-way model, there's a one-way model, and we would consider ours a heritage model. And in order to be considered dual language, you have to have at least 50% of your day of like the instruction happen in the target language. In our case, it's Keres. In our case, our language is oral, and then the other 50% in English. You can have then a 60-40 or a 70-30 or an 80-20, and the ideal is a 90-10. And we just haven't had the language resources to go higher. I think now we might be able to, in particular in our elementary classroom. And one thing we have, some people ask, well, why don't you just do elementary all in Keres? First, like at the very least, we of course would love to go higher, but there are still many parents and many families who still carry the trauma of boarding schools. That I think is every single like all Native people, especially who are still living in their tribal nations, in their tribal communities, that there's that like the insecurity that was inflicted on us about like the stereotype of being a dumb Indian. It was the goal always to be assimilated in like through the education system. And so one of the things that we have to have always assured families that who really, really want our language for their children is that your child is still going to get academics and English reading and writing and math. We just get to learn and hopefully keep our language and not have to give it up. And that's still what schools to this day require of children, is to leave especially the language at the door in order to keep going in English. So I feel like we are at a time in history where there's no reason why all schools that serve Native children should not at the very least be dual language education. But in order to have a strong dual language program, you must have strong language immersion techniques, and lots of people uh, like try to make immersion like different things, but the thing about immersion is you just have to stay in the language, which is really, really hard to do because English is so powerful. But we had a meeting with many parents and grandparents last night, and it was really beautiful to see how normalized Keres is now in a way that I hadn't seen 10 years ago, or 20 years ago when I first started working in the language program. And I think like one of the things that KCLC, Keres Children's Learning Center, has helped to cultivate is a safe space to learn and to love our language and to be in community for the sake of our language, like supporting children, but also understanding that we can't just put the burden of learning language on children. It has to be intergenerational, and that's really what we've tried to create at KCLC. So.
Also want to add that KCLC has really been a model for some of the Pueblo communities to begin to look at ways to encourage children to learn their language, and then also incorporate elders into the program. And when I worked at Keres, at the Keres Children's Learning Center, I was just so honored to be working side by side with the elders. So Trisha, can you mention their involvement in the school?
Yes. So we had elders involved from the beginning. starting with one of also the original teachers in the Cochiti Summer Language Program, which is Ann Kehi. But from there, we just brought on more elders and more elders to help with the language. And one of the beautiful things about our elders is that they're so fluent, and we had to teach them how to teach the language. Just because you're fluent in the language doesn't always mean that you know how to teach it. And it's just really, and JoAnn can attest to this because she was there at the time when we were deep in that moment where we had about 5 elders, and they were just such a joy to work with. And they like really practice our belief about lifelong learning. Like nobody told us we needed to be lifelong learners. Our people already had that value of being a lifelong learner, with the saying of "Shawish Kanyat Awisho, Shanash Kanyat Awisho," to and have an open heart and an open mind to see what you can continue to learn to continue to make a better life for our children and for our people. So it was just really fun. We would take them to the American Montessori Society conference, or the Association Montessori International, and take them to spaces that elders were not centered, often, and also often very like white spaces, and often very like people had never like really seen like native folks, and so they were also like very welcomed. And I just really am grateful that we had that chance to have our elders. Those particular elders have all retired, and I don't blame them. They like, that's just where they are. Many of them were already in their 80s when they were working with us. And now we have a new set of elders, and it is just such a joy though. And I notice the way that children who have elders in their life every day versus children that they don't move in the world very differently. And when they're around older people, like you can just see how respectful they are, and nobody has to tell them that. And so just like that normalization of not just being with our elders in our community or when the community gathers, but in their everyday school lives, because they spend so much time at school. So really like cultivating that intergenerational model.
One of the things that I also had mentioned in the previous webinar is the importance of tribal leadership and the encouragement that they give us to learn the language, because it does impact our culture and our life ways. So I think one of the things that really impressed me when I worked at KCLC also is just the fact that you were able to establish that connection with the Cochiti tribal leadership when you were starting the school. Can you talk about how that happened and where it is currently?
Yes, we I am really grateful. From the beginning I had the like enlightenment, and I feel like sometimes lots of people ask, well, like, what's your leadership model? And I'm like, I don't know. I don't even know there was such a thing as a leadership model. I feel like my leadership model was my grandparents, was my elders, was our tribal leaders, and how I observed them leading our people. Also the women, how I observed how like the women and then the gender roles. And while patriarchy does exist because of Catholicism and settler colonialism, with when the conquistadors came into New Mexico, I feel like our matriarchy is still strong despite those impositions. And if it wasn't strong, KCLC wouldn't be there, because KCLC is a Native woman-led effort. And so I feel like that is a pat on the back to our tribal leaders, who are mostly males in those positions, because they still like, no, they didn't deter me from wanting to do that. And so how we cultivated that is always sharing with our governors what was happening with KCLC. But the first thing that our two founding KCLC board members, Matthew Pecos and Dr. Joseph Swina, said is we have to go ask for permission. And so we went to ask the tribal council for permission to do KCLC in 2006. And then for another 6 years, we would meet with tribal leadership. And then if they wanted us to present to the council, we would. And because we had to open as a nonprofit, we we were also raising money. We were trying to figure out where we were going to be. We pretty much knew what the model was going to be, that it was everything else that was really hard. And then we opened on Laguna Feast Day, September 19th, 2012. And every year we go to give the new governors an update about where we're at or how things are going. And we really try to keep that line of communication open. And then when they want us to present to the tribal council, our leadership does present to the tribal council. And then I succeeded my leadership as like the co-founder of KCLC. I am no longer in charge. Our new CEO is Dr. Curtis Chavez, and our new head of school is Dr. Penny Celeste Naranjo. And they just recently had a meeting with our governors, like just for where we're at with the school year. And our tribal leadership this year has just been really, really supportive and just really wonderful. And I feel like what like it was part of it too, was also building trust and an understanding of what we were trying to do, and like doing the right, just like the right thing, and operating according to the values in our language. It's one thing to say we want our language, and it's another thing to follow its values, even when they're inconvenient. And sometimes there's that conflict between like the society, the settler colonial society we interface with, that doesn't always have our values or our best interests at heart, or what we want for our children, and trying to live out those values, because that's who we are first and foremost, is we are of our people, of our language, of our lands. And so just continuing to be in relationship and conversation with our tribal leadership.
I think it's really been good to see that happening, live when I worked there, just having that interaction. And then also the other thing that was really great was to see people who were interested in supporting KCLC, that they were able to also meet with tribal leadership. So one of the things that I think you had mentioned earlier is the importance of utilizing the Montessori method. So can you talk about that and how you came about to use that, and the alignment that it has, and how you teach the language to the children?
Yeah, so I just wanna I see Kathy here on the video, and she's one of like our Montessori elders. Um, so I graduated from college in 96. I started working for Coach T for the Summer Youth Language Immersion Program in the summers, starting in 97. And meanwhile, I was doing my teaching, working on my teacher certification and my master's in bilingual education here at UNM in Albuquerque. And then I started my first job at Cochiti Elementary School, which is on our reservation but falls under Bernalillo Public Schools. So there's 5 tribes. And the minute I started working at Cochiti Elementary School, I got introduced to the Montessori method, because they were trying to implement in their K-1-2 classes. And then I started to learn more about Montessori from Anne Vieja, and what I was really drawn to was her philosophy about children. And what I was really drawn to was how you can create a environment. It's really language immersion friendly. But what I was really drawn to was how I started reading some of, I think maybe her biography, but her first and foremost philosophy about children is that they have a spirit. And I never heard that anywhere. In schools, there's this separation of church and state, which I think is false. It's a false separation because it's just not true. Anyway, I'm not going to go into that. And, but just recognize that children have a spirit, and that is how we believe about children, that children have a spirit that needs to be protected, that they come to us with their own destiny, with their own purpose in life, and their own contributions that they're responsible to give to their community and to their world. And it's our job as adults to help to cultivate it. It is not our job to get in the way. And so that spirit of the child, and we have words for that in our language of Keres, but the deep respect that our people have for children, and that same deep respect for children, it's really the philosophy. And of course, everything else, like I said, Montessori is really language immersion friendly with its principles, and of course with the Montessori materials. But that's why I was attracted to it, because I was like, oh, we could use Montessori in service to language revitalization. And you know, Montessori isn't perfect either, but it is a beautiful philosophy that does work, I would say for 90% of its children, just based off of like my own experience. And it is, I just think it would behoove everybody to practice that more, because it follows the development of children and really tries not to hinder the growth of children, but to develop and aid the growth of the child. And again, that's another philosophy of it that matches with our own. And we have this beautiful saying in our language, like patunima, that is always the prayer to grow. And even if you're an adult and you're done physically growing, the expectation is that you're still growing emotionally and spiritually, and that you practice that value of lifelong learning.
I think that, a lot of what our elders and our tribal leadership and our communities have taught us is just that, you just have that respect for all that we are as Pueblo people. And so I think one thing that I would like for you to maybe expand upon too is how much KCLC has grown, and that maybe talk about the Indigenous Montessori Institute and how you're trying to have impact on growing new teachers.
Yeah. So here is KCLC, and we only this is our 13th year, but my 19th year working with and for KCLC. And we had the recognition pretty early on that we knew that we really couldn't send teachers to UNM or to CNM or to even to SIPI, the Southwest Indian Institute, Indian Polytechnic Institute, I think that's what it stands for, or Santa Fe Community College, which has a great early childhood program. But it's early child that's still dominated in the American assimilationist education. It's all about school readiness, and my feeling was always that children shouldn't have to get an education. It shouldn't be subtractive, it should be additive. They should be able to retain who they are as, sorry for that, who they are as who the people are that they come from, which means their language and their culture and their values. And so in 2016, I was like, okay, we have to do it. I was always thinking about, and along with my colleagues, like, we have to build the capacity of more people to be able to teach in the class. It can't just rely on me or any one person. And so we worked with people like Montessori people, and the people that were most responsive was trainers and Montessori folks from the Association Montessori International, and we met Mary Lowe, who's a Montessori trainer. She's also probably now in her 80s. And she actually said, okay, I want to train your first cohort of teachers. And in that case, that was the first year was 2018 and 2019, and we launched this partnership with the Southwest Institute of Montessori Studies, and had our first cohort in particular, again, for 3 to 6 year olds, early childhood. And that first year we graduated, I believe, 10 or 11 early childhood primary trained Montessori teachers, and probably 7 of them were Native. And to this date, we've probably graduated the most Native 3 to 6 year old early childhood Montessori teachers. Nobody is saying that, but I know we are, because we have such a concentrated amount. In our cohort this year, we have Native folks from Cochiti Pueblo, from the Hopi tribe, from the Cherokee tribe, from Chumash, the Chumash Native Nation, which is their homelands are in Santa Barbara, California. And I believe we have one more tribe, and then we also have non-native. So I think we have about a cohort of about 10 people. And so I think this is our 5th cohort. But that's not the only thing we do. We pair that, because it's not enough to just have your Montessori training. We're still growing and living in a racialized world, which is called the United States. It's still a settler colonial society that has been able to thrive off of the displacement of Native people. And to this day, the most marginalized children are Native, Indigenous children, and of course, and then Black children. And when you look at the stats of how many Native children are graduating from high school, it's still half. It's still 52%. So if only 52% of children in the United States are being graduated, what does that say about that education system? In New Mexico, I study the reading and writing and math scores all the time. All you have to do is go to the New Mexico PED, where 90% of Native children are still in public school systems, or you can go to, I forgot the National Assessment of something, NAEP. I can't remember what it stands for. And the scores, they might go up a little bit one year, but tend to stay in the 20 to 30% margins, meaning that 20%, 25, 30% of Native children are proficient in reading. Why isn't it at least 50% or 60%? And ideally 100%. So there are still very problematic issues in current systemic education settings when they're only basically graduating 50 to 60% of our children. And in the case of New Mexico, there's the Yazzie Martinez versus the state of New Mexico, where Wilhelmina Yazzie was successful in her court case against the state of New Mexico that did say New Mexico was indeed not providing an adequate education, which they say they're going to do in their state constitution. So we may not be a recognized institution of higher education, but we don't care. We know we're filling a niche, and so we offer 3 tracks that are open to everybody. Right now, we're in our Reclaiming Indigenous Education track, where we start with the federal Indian policy, federal Indian education policy, which almost everybody tells us they never had. They didn't know about. They didn't know about these key things in federal Indian education policy. We look at the work of anti-racism and what is that connection to capitalism? What is that connection to then the marginalization of Native children? Because it's all interconnected. And then And then we go into what is indigenous language immersion. We address like curriculum development through an indigenous lens. And then we talk about outcomes, the tyranny of outcomes. So that we call that, we coined that after Dr. Suina, who said, nobody will care about the education of our children as much as we do, our own people. And so he said, we need to reclaim the education of our children. And that is what we are doing in partnership with our tribe and with their blessing to operate. And then we've added 2 new tracks, which is the Indigenous School Leadership Development track that's coming up from January to May. And in the summer, we have Indigenous Language Immersion approaches, which is really one approach, and that's immersion, but that's the kind of like the how of what we do at KCLC. And then we work simultaneously, all Native folks. If anybody gets a scholarship from KCLC, they have to do the Reclaiming Indigenous Education model, because you can certainly still do Montessori and still be part of replicating a system of harm. And that's what we have to build this critical consciousness about, is how do we understand history, present and future, and what is it that we want for our children. And we have to hold on to that vision of freedom to be who we were meant to be in this world. And that's according to our creation story, our Pueblo creation stories. And again, to what our people, our ancestors thought our purpose in this life is. And our children are of our tribes. They come from us. They come through from a matrilineal society. And they're still in schools that are trying to assimilate them into the value of school readiness. Well, what does school readiness have to do with being a Cochiti person or a Zuni person or a Cherokee person? We only need that right now because we have to interface with, again, a settler colonial society. Our children shouldn't have to give up who they are to be in school. They can still get school without giving up who they are. And that's what school has required of them, not asked of them, starting in the 1870s with boarding school. So, hopefully someday we will become a Montessori accredited teacher training center that can on our own. Maybe we won't. We don't know. But what we do know is that if UNM or anywhere else local was doing what we needed them to do, this wouldn't have to exist. I say this because I'm here at our Indigenous Montessori Institute in Albuquerque right now. But it is open to everybody. Anybody can participate, and that's all. All that information is on our website.
Hey, thank you, Trisha. I'm glad that you're able to share all of that information. I think we're at a point where if people have questions, and Kim will help with this part. Kim.
Hi, yeah, thanks. We've got a couple questions here. So Dana Bagshaw asked, could you explain what you mean about values of your language and give an example?
So Dr. Larry Emerson, who was Navajo, was this brilliant, amazing philosopher. He was a professor, I believe, at Navajo Dene College. I don't remember where that is. But one time I was in one of his lectures, and he talked about how our people didn't need another civilization to hold it up, contrary to what we see written in history books. Every single tribal nation, and there was probably more than 575 outside of that federally recognized tribes, there's way more than that. Every single one of us could stand on our own. And so in our language, everything is embedded. Our indigenous knowledge systems, our values, our worldviews. And so in our indigenous knowledge system lies what we believe about land. Languages are sprung from the land that that they are from. We don't have a word for ocean because we don't live by the ocean. You know, we have words for what is in our environment. But every single tribal nation has an indigenous knowledge system around kinship. How strong it is today, varies, and that is not anybody's fault because the goal has always been to erase the native, to erase the indigenous, the indigene, as Patrick Wolf has talked about in his work, and Eve Tuck, all these scholars. But there is a value about children that is missing from American society, and that is that they are precious, that they have a spirit, that they come to us with a purpose, and it is our job to help them fulfill that purpose for the good of the community and of the land and the people, to teach them how to live, not just for themselves, but in service to the community. So we want to grow strong children, not just to survive, but to thrive. There are values around how each tribal nation views a plant. In corporations, they just go and cut down a tree. But there is protocol for how you approach a plant or a tree if you do have to cut it down for the sake of survival, if you do have to kill the animal out of survival. That's why there's all these ceremonies for strawberries. I'm thinking of the Mohawk and the Seneca in the Northeast, or for blankets, or for the eagle, or for the deer, or thinking of the California tribes, or the smoke dance, different anything, that all these beautiful ceremonies that our people came up because they were humble. They had so much humility because they knew they were at the mercy of Mother Nature. And so how that value of how do we live with as opposed to power over. And in settler colonial, the European settlers, the values that was brought with the church is eminent domain, right? We can take God gave us this world, so we can do whatever we want without worrying about what effect it has on land, on other living things. So there was always that recognition for our people that we have to live together, and we are no better than that plant or that tree or that animal, and that value of respect for other living things. And one time I blew the engine on my car, and my grandpa got really mad at me, and he told me, "Your car needs water." He told me in Keres he was getting mad at me, and it needs oil, and it has a heart. It takes care of you. Everything has a spirit. He's to getting mad, getting after me. But that belief that you teach you approach everything with that, that it has that spirit and that dignity, that it has a right to exist.
Thank you, Trisha. I do have a comment here. You're right, though. Church is deeply embedded in the state, but it's only the colonial Abrahamic church that is allowed. I think this was in regards to the church and state comment. Just wanted to share that. And then we do have a question. I work in cultural resource management. How strongly tied to the land is the language in the view of the Pueblos, and how necessary is positive language identity for young Pueblos on their land? From Kendrick.
That's a really loaded question. So I think to the first one, like, languages are sprung from the land, that of the environment. Like, I think it's really, really beautiful to learn about, like, Alaskan natives way up north, and all any tribal language. And Robin Kilmer, I don't know how you say her last name, but in Braiding Sweetgrass, she talks about the language of animacy, and how in noun-based languages like English, they're like, nouns are dead. And then she talks about how in many native languages, they're like, the words to describe a bay is like alive, and water in the bay, and how they have a word for that in Potawatomi. And because we have by design been displaced from our language through school, we can only build a strong identity with language when we build settings that are compassionate and loving to people who want to learn them or want their children to relearn. And so there are many people that have what my grandpa here calls language trauma, where then they shut down and they don't have a positive identity with it because first of all, they were our great grandpas and grandmas, or our grandmas, or even some of our parents were punished for speaking it, even in public schools, even in BIE schools, Bureau of Indian Education schools. So we can't, every situation is different for every single one of us, and how we build a positive language identity for our children is to normalize it and have them see it in their everyday school lives and not just at home. But we live in a time in history where it has to be present in their everyday school life, because they aren't going to value it. They're going to continue to see English as the language of prestige, and nobody has to tell them that. That's a subtle but strong message that children pick up early on. And so when our early childhood settings are already starting in English, that's when there's a negative, that I feel like that's when that negative viewpoint of our language starts, because it is not present in their everyday life. And it took 2 weeks for our own daughter to start transplanting Keres words with English words.
Thank you, Trisha. I have a question. What are the best ways that we can support KCLC and your work?
I think the best way for us to support schools like KCLC is to do our own examination of ourselves and our own consciousness, and where do we practice things that are anti-Indigenous. American society is based on anti-indigeneity. And so how are we reconciling where we benefit from that and who's marginalized, right? It's easy just to say, well, we'll just donate. That's like surface stuff. Where we want to get to is getting states and normalizing, and I don't know how, when and if this will happen, but normalizing the flow of monies to language survival schools, because language survival schools are the antidote to boarding schools. And so somebody did a calculation of how much money that the United States spent on boarding schools and paying missionaries and missions to have boarding schools, and it was in the millions. And they included like that inflation in today's, what that amount of money would be today, and it's billions of dollars. It's billions of dollars that it's going to take to help us regain our languages. So I think, like, what in ourselves do we need to think about, and then of course, like, we're always grateful for donations, but we still live in a society that is capitalistic. And of course, like, how are we loving and supporting children? James Baldwin has this beautiful quote about children where he says that, and I want to read it to you, but again, it's this philosophy. It's this philosophy about the children being all the children in our world. They belong to all of us, and if we don't believe that deeply, then there is something very wrong. And the quote goes, "The children are always ours, every single one of them, all over the globe, And I am beginning to suspect that whoever is incapable of recognizing this may be incapable of morality. And so, what are our practices around how we make space for children? And the way American society does not support children and families is not it. The way that they are complicit in genocide and perpetuating wars on children, that's not it either. So how are we advocating for especially Black and brown children, but children everywhere? How do we make it so that all the children are truly ours, as James Baldwin calls us to do? And there's a beautiful new book. There's a beautiful new book that just came out by James Baldwin, not by him, but about him, and it's called, what is it called? It's called Go Tell It to the Mountain. Go Tell It How James Baldwin Became a Writer. But I just think like that, like how do we advocate for children? How in our own homes, in our own families, how are we talking about power over children versus power with? How are we in solidarity with our iwas? Our iwas is the Keres word for children.
Thank you, Trisha. There's a great documentary on James Baldwin as well that I recommend everyone go check out. Awesome. So Dana asks another question. She said, what do you think of the land back movement?
I mean, I think at the very least, if there was a certain boundary promised to a tribe outlined in whatever original treaty there was, or the federal government said they would give them, then that's the very least that should be that land back right there. Tribes should not have to fight for their basic land rights. They're not asking for more than what was already rightfully on their ancestral lands. The Agua de Cuda, one of the Paiute tribes, asked if the lake, the very fish, they call themselves the cutthroat trout people, because that is how they have survived in their creation story and through time immemorial. And they asked the government, the federal government, okay, we are going to accept the terms of our boundaries. All we ask is that you give us this lake, because that is who and where we come from. And then you get settlers coming in and they take the land away. And now that trout is extinct. That very cutthroat trout that they named themselves after, I can't say it, it's in the Paiute language, it's gone. And that lake the water is not clean. And so, like, it behooves everybody, if you want your great-grandchildren to have a planet to live on, then we need to act now. We already needed to act yesterday. And one of the ways that is going to help get us there is our indigenous languages, is indigenous folks, and not just mindlessly buying stuff, because corporations want us just to buy stuff so that capitalism can keep going. What is the new world that we are imagining for our children? Because somebody imagined this world and we're here. This does not have to be normalized. When children are being killed, when forests are being cut down, when glaciers are melting, like, how are we not alarmed by that? The world is already on fire. Why are we not freaking out about that?
Onyenye, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. She said, yes, Trisha, thank you for saying this. That's very powerful. Thank you, Trisha.
Are there any additional questions for Trisha? There is a comment in the chat that says, huge thank you to this wonderful webinar, which I hope to share with our Right Relationship Boulder Education and Schools group. So with that, thank you, Ta'a. Thank you for all your words and sharing of your knowledge and talking about the importance of language, our land, and our people, and and especially our children. Amo iwas. And so nice just to say to I'll turn it back over to Kim or Jonna to say final words.
Yes, thank you, JoAnn and Trisha. Thank you for sharing information and insight about the history and language revitalization. Thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions or if we were unable to get to your question today, please send us an email and we'll be sure to follow up. We look forward to seeing you all again on Monday, December 9th for our third webinar in this series, where we will be having a conversation with Kevin Shendo, Director of Education at Pueblo Villages. You'll be receiving a survey through email today or tomorrow. If you could please complete the survey, we would greatly appreciate it. Thank you all and have a wonderful, wonderful day and holiday. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Trisha.
Conversation.
Thank you.